Good morning, good afternoon, whatever time of day it is when you're watching. My name is Deborah Shaffer, longtime documentary filmmaker, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to this conversation with Seth Wessler, the director of one of the short films that's on the shortlist for the Academy Awards this year called The Facility. And I have some experience with immigration and detention and asylum issues, so I was interested in this subject, but more than that, I was really taken with this film, with a lot of aspects of it, which we're going to get into. And Seth is a journalist, and it's hard to believe this is his first film because it's very skillfully done. So without further ado, Seth, is there anything you want to say by way of introduction, or I have some questions prepared that I wanted to get the conversation rolling with, and I'm sure you have a lot to say.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you about it.
Okay, well, I guess the first thing, just to get it out of the way before we go, is I wanted an update on what's happening now with Nielsen and with Andrea. Has her asylum case been heard yet?
Yeah, I actually spoke with both of them yesterday. I'm in pretty regular touch. Nielsen is just north of Atlanta. He's living with his wife and his son and, trying to move ahead with his life as it was before he was detained. He's waiting for his immigration case to move forward. He'll probably get a green card. He was always probably going to get a green card, which is one of the striking things here. I mean, there was no need for him to be detained. He was almost certainly going to get out, but he was held for more than a year. Andrea's in California. She's with her husband, and she's waiting through this protracted legal process trying to get asylum. These cases can drag on for years and years and leave people in real limbo in that process. And it was the same for Andrea. Her detention was completely discretionary. She, as a matter of law, did not have to be held in a jail for 2 years while her case processed, and she could have been at home with her husband, and she now is, and her case is proceeding, and she's of course showing up for court. So, that's one of the things that I think was really striking about this film and these two people's experience. Is unclear entirely why they had to be locked up in the first place.
Well, I imagine that that's the case with many, and probably most of the people who are in detention in these facilities around the U.S., which I think is over 20,000 right now. Anyway, so what I'm curious about is how you found these two people, how you actually started this particular project. Were you reporting on Irwin? Were you reporting on a bunch of facilities? What's the genesis of the project? And then how did it turn into a film? Because as a reporter, I'm guessing you were starting out to do a story,
Absolutely.
a news story about them, and it turned into a movie.
Yeah, in the beginning of the pandemic, we all sort of remember February and March of 2020, right? I mean, the world was just sort of rupturing. Our plans, everybody's plans were getting turned on their head. Stuff was shutting down. We were figuring out what the world was going to look like at the beginning of the pandemic. And I, as a reporter, began trying to figure out what was happening in ICE detention centers and in other carceral facilities around the country. I report on immigration, I report on the criminal justice system. And so, I intended initially just to write a series of news stories about ICE detention in the pandemic, these places that are tightly packed, have been known for, histories of medical neglect in the past. And I wanted to know what was happening inside. And so I did. I published a series of news stories and then slowed down a little bit to write a magazine feature for the New York Times Magazine about the Irwin County Detention Center and the spread of COVID. And the mode that I used to report was this video visitation app that's installed by a private company inside of ICE detention centers around the country. You pay 25 cents a minute, which is actually quite expensive for people. Mostly it's used by people's relatives on the outside. Call in, and the calls last for up to 15 minutes. And I found myself calling over and over again into this detention center. So there's video streaming onto my computer, which I was capturing because I often record interviews. And And I was sort of reporting these print and web stories about the Irwin County Detention Center and other ICE detention centers. But it became immediately sort of clear to me that I was also seeing something that was really, really compelling and really overwhelming. I was spending so much time on these calls, right? I mean, I was often on video calls for hours a day, sometimes late into the night. And I had this experience like I was almost present. I mean, clearly I was in the safety of my home, but I was there so often that I was starting to see the sort of rhythm of life inside of these detention centers. I would call in the evenings, often at 6 or 7 p.m. And I realized that every day at 6 or 7 p.m. in one of the cell blocks where I was calling men who were detained in Irwin, people would pray, they would hold church. And so I was hearing the prayers every day, or I began to notice the television playing in the background, or notice people walking to the telephones to presumably call their lawyers or their families. And it just struck me that there was no way that I could carry that visual world, that visual story forward in writing. It just wasn't working. In fact, I sort of tried, and I was moved by what I was seeing, and I decided to pivot into to make a film, to try to make a film about this place and about some of the people who I met inside. Nilsen and Andrea, I was speaking with probably 24 people in Irwin through these videos, and all of these people were sources of mine. I was trying to figure out what was happening. Nobody was masked. The virus was spreading inside. There was very little protection. People had no idea what was happening. And I was trying to tell that story of sort of chaos and crisis in a detention center. And so I was talking to many people. But Nilsen and Andrea, first of all, I was put in touch with each of them by other people held inside. And in each case, they said, we think you should talk to Nilsen, or we think you should talk to Andrea. They've been really important in our cell block, in our unit, holding us together, sometimes holding meetings, gathering other folks together to kind of figure out what was going on. And when I began talking with each of them, it was clear to me that they were, in their own ways, sort of leaders inside of the cell blocks that held 30 or 40 or 50 people. And they began to sort of, we began to talk daily. They were both, incredibly clear and compelling to me. And really importantly, they both decided that they wanted to kind of be part of the process of documenting what was happening in this place. And so making this film required that each of them pick up the call each time I called, right? To sort of, I've described it this way, to sort of open the other side of this portal that this video chat thing created between my computer and me on the outside and these folks on the inside.
Did you always have to call them, or they could call you also?
No, I always had to call them. There's no way to call out. You can only call in. There were moments when the film tells the story in part of a series of protests that happened in the Irwin County Detention Center. And, the detention center controlled access to these video systems. So there were times when it just turned off. But for the most part, they were there, and it allowed me to kind of be as present as is possible from the outside when nothing was happening, in these sort of mundane moments of life. And then when really big things were happening, when officers would show up in a unit, or when people who were held there were trying to organize themselves, or were confronting a guard. And so that sort of regularity of calls, I think, made this film possible.
I think this is one of those, as a filmmaker, I think this is one of those like really extreme cases where you took what could be an incredible limitation. No option to get a camera in there. Did you even ever meet them in person, by the way?
Not until after they were released. And I still actually have not met Andrea in person. Nilsen and I have met.
I figured that was the case. You're not allowed to, how could you? So, this is a case where you took an extreme limitation, which was an inability to actually go there and meet the people you're interviewing, and no camera, no proper camera. You turned it, you found a way, and I assume the field of vision team helped, or I don't know, wow, all that happened if you want to talk about it,
Yeah.
but turned it into a real virtue with that really stark frame.
Mhm.
And, you know, it works. It really
Yeah.
works. And then you put yourself up in the corner sometimes so we don't forget that you're there. And then
Yeah. I mean,
you had the option of the outside, you know, you had the option of the outside footage, which I assume you either, you know, organized a crew to go and get when you knew something was happening, or you went
right.
yourself, but you had the protests outside. And the news footage was invaluable. I think the, you know, CNN and Telemundo and the other news sources really
Yeah.
fleshed it out so that, you know, we really, in 30 minutes, we really know a lot. Oh, I wanted to go back to one other thing you said too, because I think with these two characters, which I think they're so strong because they're also so vulnerable, both
Mhm.
of them.
Yeah.
You know, and I
Yeah.
really appreciated that about them, that they're not just the, they show they show their emotions. It's I mean, this is the most, I guess we're so inundated right now with things about refugees around the world, and these are internal refugees in the United States. I mean, if any of us, you know, put ourselves in their shoes, you know,
Yeah. You know, these relationships with people who began as, you know, sources for my journalism, right? I mean, they became really profound over the 8 months that we were in touch on these calls. And I think that for both Nilsson and Andrea, they've both said this, you know, to them, these calls felt like an access point to the outside. I mean, there was a tremendous amount of fear. I've been reporting on ICE detention for a long time, and I've never seen this much fear inside of these places as I did during the COVID, the beginning, the early months of the pandemic. And I think that these calls became a space also for both Nilsson and Andrea to try to figure out what was happening on the outside, to make sure that they were heard, to make sure that they weren't forgotten. Both of them were scared of dying inside of this place. And so, you know, a lot of that vulnerability comes from a place of tremendous fear. And we developed, I think, really, really deep relationships over the period of 8 months in these calls. And, you know, uh, they were taking risks inside as organizers, and they wanted to make sure that they weren't doing that without a witness. And I think that was part of why they decided to have these calls. You know, I want to say something about the frame. For me, as a reporter, it's pretty unlikely that I would have allowed myself to sit for hundreds of hours in front of a computer screen as a reporter, thinking that that's like a good way to report a story, if it hadn't been for the pandemic. In a funny way, the pandemic made it possible for me to even imagine that this could be a way to tell a story, to sit in front of my computer. I mean, you know, I value going out in the world and meeting people. And the pandemic made that impossible for us to do, for lots of people to do in lots of ways. But these detention centers, it never would have been possible for me to tell this story. I couldn't have gotten inside with a camera. I've tried before. You know, detention centers don't let people in these days. And so I think that the condition of the pandemic made it possible for me to sit back and say, like, you know, I am going to spend my time. This is a kind of immersive reporting and a kind of immersive filmmaking. It made it possible to gather this sort of this archive of footage and to tell these stories. And for me, the frame became a world in itself. So, you know, as I mentioned, like the televisions in the background, there's news footage that appears in my film. That news footage is all either footage that did appear or could have been appearing inside of that detention center at that very time on TVs that we see on the walls of the detention center. You know, I tried until the very end of the film to keep everything that we see in this film contained by the constraints of the camera that I had, this sort of fixed camera that didn't move and was, you know, very tight on the people I was talking to or on a very particular background, and also constrained by what it would have been possible for people who were there to see, so that I hope could create something like an experience of being there, could get people closer to kind of getting a sense of what it is like physically, visually, emotionally to be in this box, this place that is built to keep people sequestered, to keep people away from the outside, that really function often as black boxes.
Did you, there's a couple of questions, but a quick one, did you ask them sometimes to just, when you called in to say, you don't have to sit here, just leave, because you have a lot of times just the empty frame watching everything, and that's a very effective kind of transition and in between. Did you set that up or it just happened?
Yeah, no, we, after some weeks of doing interviews, I really wanted to be able to capture the backgrounds and, to the extent possible in this film, to pull the background forward, and so I asked Nilsson and Andrea and others, like after we talked, if I could call back and they might answer and just step away from the frame so I could keep it running. And, I started to notice the same people moving back and forth, or I would see people I'd interviewed a week ago walk by the camera. And so, for me, that was part of the experience of making the film, and I hope part of what people who see the film kind of can experience as well.
I want to bring up something more also about these facilities. I think at the end there's a title that says that the contract, that ICE has terminated their contract with Irwin. I want to point out to people who may not be aware, these are private facilities. These are not, right? I mean, Irwin is not, it's not a governmental jail. It's not regulated by the laws of the United States. People who are in these facilities do not have the rights of ordinary criminals, of murderers, of anybody who's in jail. They have actually zero, am I overstating it if I say they have zero?
I think the
law?
As a matter of sort of law and policy, the contracts that federal agencies sign with private companies set a set of rules and standards that they're supposed to comply with. But the reality is that the people who are running the operation of these detention centers, the day-to-day lives of the people who are held inside, they are run by private companies who have a profit interest, who are in this for profit. And most people held in ICE detention are held in privately operated detention and prisons like Irwin. One of the things that, so for, people held inside, trying to figure out what's happening, you can't ask the government what's happening. And there's a moment in the film when an ICE officer shows up in the unit where Nilsson is held. And, first of all, he lies to the people who are held inside, to Nilsson and others, and said, no, COVID's not a problem here. Nobody has COVID. And they all know that that's not true. So there's this government official lying. But then when they're confronted, when Nilsson confronts him, he sort of turns and says, everything's messed up and the facility will tell you what's going on. That is to say, this private company will tell you what it's decided to do with you. I mean, that's a real kind of basic dereliction, right, by the government. And I think that's how ICE detention operates. Andrea is punished with isolation. She's sent to an isolation cell. And she's put in isolation for 2 weeks as a result of helping to make a protest video that's released by somebody's family member online using this video visitation app. The private company imposed its own disciplinary standards and sent her for 2 weeks to an isolation cell. That's not ICE deciding that. That's not the government deciding. It's this arbitrary decision by a private company that's decided to send her into a solitary confinement unit.
It's an extremely distressing situation. How did you get connected with Field Division? Had you already been working with them on other things, or at what point did they come into the process, or did you go to them and say, "Listen, I've got this stuff, and I'm thinking what I should do with it"?
Yeah, I had talked to Field Division actually about another project earlier that I'm still thinking about. Field Division is remarkable because it has this commitment to supporting film work with journalists. And I think, that was really exciting to me. I've long been interested in visual work. I think a lot about visual work, but I'm primarily a print and audio journalist. And so we had talked, and as I was gathering this footage, it was clear to me that there was something there. I didn't know if that would be a 10-minute film, a 5-minute film, video project, a 10-minute thing, could have been a feature documentary, but I really felt strongly that there was a visual story to tell. So I brought Field of Vision some of that early footage, a few scenes, and they very quickly saw, I think, what I saw in the material, that there was a rich visual world. They were interested in some of the kind of visual language I was talking about around this idea of a portal, like thinking about porting into a place that we're not supposed to be. And so very quickly they signed on. And then we brought on Patricia Benabe as the producer, who helped build a really wonderful team. Lindsay Cordero was the editor on the project, and she was essential to kind of thinking about how to construct a film that had a rhythm that would make sense out of this material. And I think that team grew into a really wonderful group of people who made this film possible. And Field of Vision along the way supported that work. And then my time as a reporter continued to be supported by Type Investigations, which is a outfit that supports independent journalists. And so I was able to continue reporting as well on ICE detention along the way.
Yeah, I think it's stylistically very effective and very well put together, and the intertitles and I love the way you handled the bilingual. I love the bilingual credits. I haven't seen it done quite that way before, where they just switch from English to Spanish, and I thought it was great. I thought it was very elegant.
Yeah, I mean, the film was in both languages, and we wanted that to be clear. This was a film that operated because it could operate in English and Spanish.
Yeah, and it really does. I hadn't noticed it so much till we got to the end, because I understand Spanish. So, but it really it works very beautifully, I think. And will they be able to? I don't know where now. The film has been at a couple of festivals. Have Andrea and Nielsen haven't been able to join you at any of that, or have they?
Well, so many festivals are remote these days, but Andrea did go to the AFI Fest in LA, and she saw the film on the big screen, which was really exciting to her. Nielsen's waiting for an opportunity to do that. We've been able to do press together about the film. We've been on MSNBC, on PBS, talking about the film and about what's happened since. And, Nielsen's become an organizer since his detention. He was not doing political work in any sort of way before he was detained, and he became an organizer inside, and he's now continuing to do that. And so, the film has been a way for him to sort of talk about his organizer origin story as he goes out into the community to focus on sort of supporting people who've been detained, and to target detention centers. Andrea has sort of similar aspirations. She's waiting for her case to move forward. But I think for them, they wanted a light to be shown on what was happening in this place. And so I think the film has been gratifying to them as a way that sort of their experience has been documented, in this 30 minutes to the extent it is possible. There's what happened to them in this place that, again, really normally functions as a black box. It's now out there in the world.
Yeah, I hope ICE doesn't use this as an excuse I hope they don't start taking away the video.
Yeah.
As expensive as they are. I mean, this is another profit thing, right? It used to be when I was visiting people in detention, the telephones were only private, and it was also, I forget, but it was huge amounts of money every minute for people in detention to call out, or for people to call them, and there was no other choice, and you couldn't have
the video is still there, but many of these places have switched to a technology where the video fixes to a face, and if a face is not filling the frame, it turns off. And I think that was precisely because a number of reporters were using this as a reporting tool. I don't know if it was a result of this film. I hope not. I mean, it's an important access point, although these kinds of things, arguably should be free. There's this is there's another contractor who contracts with the private company who makes a profit on the video call apps. So it's just tremendous money being
and there are people who make money on the food services and everything. It's a huge business.
Yeah,
it's a huge employer for certain areas. We know this, and provides employment, and of course, the more monies in some places, it used to be the more money the contractors could save in housing and feeding the prisoners,
right,
the more money went to the county government. Or
absolutely, and that's still true in many county jails around the country. I mean, it's not just a private prison problem, but yeah, I mean, these places are what's I think particular about these places is that they are, they're particularly opaque because you have to get through the contracting agency to the company to really learn information. And it's what this camera allowed me to circumvent in a certain way.
Is there any, we're being warned that we're about out of time. Is there any kind of last thing you want to leave people with?
Yeah, I mean, as I think about the story of this detention center, you noted earlier that Irwin Detention Center itself has lost its contract with ICE. So there aren't actually immigration detainees being held there anymore. That's in part because this particular detention center sort of erupted into the national spotlight after there were allegations that a gynecologist was performing, unnecessary abusive procedures on women who were held at this particular facility. But I think it's pretty clear that that the attention that sort of fell on this place just wouldn't have happened had it not been for the kind of organizing that was happening inside of this place. One of the things that that was profound to me was the level of connection between people held inside of these cell blocks and the kind of level of remarkable solidarity that grew inside. And so, when Irwin started to get this national attention after these allegations about the doctor, people inside were already organized, in part because of the work that Nilsen and Andrea had done, and were able to sort of lift up their voices from the inside and be a powerful part of that push to get the contract canceled. There were lots of things that led to the decision by the Biden administration to end this particular contract, and most detention centers are still open, and the kinds of abuses and suffering that this film documents happen in most detention centers. But I really think part of the story here is like a story of people connecting with one another, and I hope the film goes some distance to tell that story, of deep connection, of solidarity, and that also, the film was only possible because of this sort of sustained connection between me and these two particular people, Nilsen and Andrea, inside.
Well, congratulations to all of you, really. And I hope the film, continues to have a big life on this coming season, both on the award circuit, which is one kind of place for it to work, and then in the organizing world, which is another place. It has a lot of work to do. So,
well, thank you.
Congratulations again. Really great
for talking about this, Deborah.
Oh, my pleasure.
Yeah.